There's a concept in building that I've found a nice graphic of. They called the triangle of truth. And I will show what the triangle of truth is. And essentially, it's a continuous range of parameters where you can make something good, fast, and cheap. But in that triangular shape, you can only ever achieve two of those three in any one item. So you can make something that's very good, and you can make it either fast, but it will be costly, or you could make it good and cheap, but it's going to take a long time. Or you can make something fast and cheap, but it won't be good. So there's always a trade-off. And I think that this is aptly named the Triangle of Truth because those things are inherent in the way that the earth is, in that it's finite and we are finite, and only God can make things that are perfect and ideal. If we emphasize, obviously, the highest, we could say the highest of those things is the good concept. We can certainly achieve great things, but we will have to pay a high price either in time or in material and waste. However, good is not always the highest ideal as far as the quality, because for certain circumstances, it's not necessary. And if it's not necessary to make it good, then you are wasting by not focusing on fast and cheap. The philosophically minded person will get caught up in always thinking of the quality and that something could be better and it can always be better. Platonic search for the ideal is never satisfied. It never knows when something is good enough to stop and move on to something else. And the more practically minded person can make those judgment calls. And there's actually a great deal of wisdom in knowing when and how to do that. How do we know? So let's take, for example, like a cathedral. Now, a cathedral that was crafted in the Middle Ages are massive buildings, beautifully adorned with all sorts of decorative things. What is that? That's definitely designed for the good, the concept of making it the highest quality that it could have. And we know that obviously one thing that was sacrificed was fast, because some of these things took many hundreds of years to make. In fact, whoever started building it never got to see the finishing. However, they also were, in a sense, built rather cheaply. They could have gone even slower if they had paid the workers better, or if they had paid more for the materials. They may have been able to get some of them faster. Some of this is not necessarily the case. It just was, these were like maximal construction projects that really took all the resources of an area. But nevertheless, by focusing on the good, they sacrificed the fast, and to a certain extent, it's tough to say, they could have spent more, but maybe that wouldn't have gained them anything. They had already maximized what they were spending as far as available resources and people. So, is this a worthwhile thing? Many would say that it is, because we have these transcendent places. You know, this is a long scale project that's kind of attributing to this vision of a global takeover of the universal church, and that it's going to be worth it for future generations. Meanwhile, there's people that are working on this thing for their whole life, and they're never going to see the fruits of their labor. Would it have been better to build a lesser building faster and cheaper? It's difficult to say. If you finished your cathedral in 1500 and then there was a Reformation and some Protestants destroyed most of it, then yeah, you probably would have been better off building it faster and cheaper. You could have gotten more use out of it. Or like the one in, I think it's in Cologne, Germany, that was unfinished for hundreds of years because of the Reformation. And really, there was a very different philosophy in the building of things. Now, perhaps you could say we go too far in the fast and cheap categories now, as far as building churches. But there are other reasons why and other times when it is wise to do that. If you're building a chair, what is the purpose of it? Is it going to be a gift you're going to give it away, or is it because you urgently need a place to sit? If you urgently need a place to sit, you might do better finding a tree stump or a rock or a bucket. If you're looking to build an heirloom that you can share with your descendants for generations, then you need to start considering the quality of the material you want to use, which is going to affect the price. But perhaps you already have material and it's not of the greatest quality. You know, if you're going to build a chair out of pine, spending 100 hours on it versus 8 or 10 is not going to yield you a net result that's much greater, because the inherent qualities of the material are just not going to be enhanced that much. But another thing to consider in this is the experience of the creation of this object. And in this aspect, I think we can look at, back to the cathedral and say, did all those people who started the cathedral and worked on it, and some of them worked for their whole working life and then retired if they had any sort of retirement, or whenever they were too old to work effectively, and then passed away and they never got to see this thing completed, but were they still able to benefit from that experience? Well, certainly if they were paid and they were able to raise a family and sustain a household, that was worthwhile. But would the stonemasons that worked on a part of a cathedral that wouldn't be finished in their lifetime, would they take the same effort to make things perfect as they did on the cathedral when it came to building their own house? Would they even build their own house? Would it be cheaper to buy a house from somebody who'd already made one? Would it be cheaper to buy a house and build a house that was made out of sticks and mud rather than stone? Could possibly be the case. That experience of making a thing, it does not just make the thing. It also makes the person. There are lessons that you can learn through the process of making things that sometimes require waste. And in a sense, what you're doing is you're taking that triangle of truth and you're adding another element to it, which is experience. You can gain experience in all three of those areas. And the expertise that you gain in how to make things good will guide you to know when it is worth it to spend more money and when it's more important to take more time. The expertise that you gain in understanding the cheapness of it will guide you in understanding when it's better to wait and search for a better deal on the material or a better find, or even to identify, as they say, one man's trash, which could be another man's treasure. And this is a lesson I've learned, because there's a lot of stuff that people throw away, especially if you know how to work wood. It may not necessarily just be wood, but it's something that can be deconstructed, and if it's made out of good material, it can be reused again. And that can save you a tremendous amount of money. And when to take the time, because there may be in the process of making something, you can break down your big pieces of lumber quickly to a rough size. But then you're going to spend much more time removing the small shavings between a set of dovetails to get it to be a perfect fit. And this is even the way you see in most of the building of a house. Framing goes up, the sheathing goes on, the house looks like it's almost done. But in reality, it's about a quarter of the way finished, and there's a lot more time to do much smaller details on the outside and in the inside. So the more knowledge and expertise you gain in these things, the better you're able to assess which of those areas should be focused on. And sometimes it could be not to try to maximize two, but to take the best balance of all three. Perhaps you have material. The material that you have may not be suited to what you want ideally to make. For instance, these guitars are all made out of very particular woods, and if I had woods from pallets or construction lumber or something like that, without really maximizing the amount of time and probably spending a lot of money on some specialty tools, I would not be able to build a good guitar out of them. It wouldn't be the same. And even if I put all the effort in, it would not have all the characteristics because it's just not what the material is optimized for. Whereas if I had the maple and the mahogany and the ash that these are made out of, it would be a waste to use it to build a doghouse or something to hide my trash cans, because that's not the best use of those materials. And so I think that it's really easy to think about these things in an idealized way. But if you go to like a museum, you're going to see a lot of mundane objects. And it could be that the ones you see there are the best crafted of those particular objects. But the fact of the matter is, 99.999% of the chairs from the 1700s are no longer in existence. They were smashed and broken and burned as firewood, probably. But we have a few, and from those we can learn a lot about that thing. And so I think that really the other thing about this aspect of time is to consider how long does this thing need to last for. And of course, something like a cathedral is meant to last for a very, very long time. In many ways, the buildings have outlived their usefulness for what they were intended, because most of them don't have active congregations in them anymore. And even in a relatively young country like America, this is true of many of the older churches. They've been converted into something else because the building has lasted longer than the congregation of people. Knowing that that may be the case, it's okay to take that into consideration when we choose our materials and our designs and our efforts. And this is something that I really like about the imagery in the Bible of the tent and the tabernacle and even the temple itself. All of them were temporary. In the fact that the tabernacle is constructed first, we can see that it's by design. God created the tabernacle as a temporary place to dwell. And then he had something else in mind. And then the temple itself was to be done away with, and it becomes a symbol of God's incarnation, the body of Christ. You can see other aspects of this practicality in the Bible. Like, I really like the example of the Ark of the Covenant, where it says, it's supposed to be made of wood and covered with gold. And that's such a practical thing that it's almost odd to see it in like a spiritual text. Because if you think about the other cultures of the day, first of all, none of them were having a mobile temple construction. They all, They came from Egypt, where they built these massive pyramids and other temples and things like that. Everything about that construction process and the elements of worship was designed to impose this kind of transcendent permanence through the hugeness and the solidity and the permanence of the structure. And so it would be easy to assume that in a house of worship, the objects that look like gold are going to be made out of solid gold, because that's what a god would want. If they weren't, that information would probably be kept private, because in reality, most of these craftsmen would probably save their money by covering something with gold and using a cheaper material on the inside. But for the case of the ark, this information is fully disclosed. And what is God saying in that? He's saying this box is very important, but wood is a fine material for this box to be constructed of. It's lighter, it's stiffer than solid gold. In many ways, it's more durable in some aspects. And then the gold can be overlaid on the top as an adornment. And then you have this kind of like mixing together of the more mundane and the more special objects. And I think that that's kind of an amazing thing. And especially to think that this is the way that God described for it to be. There's a good lesson to learn about the way we do things. And when it's best to put all of our resources towards something versus where it's better to focus on getting something done quickly, and where it's better to save some cost. And the construction of the tabernacle really balances all those things. It's got very many elements in it. And even the temple itself is constructed in many ways out of cedar with stone and gold and all these things. And the really interesting thing about it is that all these materials were created by God. And so when we prefer one over the other, we're imposing a sort of a supernatural specialization to that thing that God doesn't necessarily put. We think gold is greater than wood. Well, one of the things that's great about gold is that God designed it in such a way that it can be hammered extremely thin. And we prize it because it's rare, but with only a small amount of gold, it can be hammered out into such a thin sheet that it covers a large object. What happens is you expose more of its beauty in that reflective, shiny quality that it has. For other things, it's good that we don't cover everything with gold, because when you look at a piece of furniture, the way that you can discern if it's well built and well constructed and if it's going to last a long time is by looking at the grain of the wood, the grain that the builder chose, how straight it runs in the lengths and the direction that it goes, and how it's fitted together in the various parts. Because if you choose the right parts of the wood and the right direction, that's what gives something its strength and longevity. More so even than choosing a more expensive wood versus a cheaper wood, because those woods will all expand and contract at the same rate. And if you construct it the wrong way, it's going to crack. If it cracks, moisture gets in, it begins to rot, it begins to decompose. If you run all the joints in the right direction and the grain is going all the right way, the whole object will expand and contract in the same direction. It's like a living object in a way. It breathes. And that flexibility that's put into it helps it to last a long time. As examples, this little box was made as a gift for my wife for Christmas. So it's kind of supposed to have that candy cane stripe kind of look. And this is more expensive material. and I got it for free, most of this stuff. But it was small pieces of wood with a nice grain. It's got some kind of striping to it. It's a little tough to see, probably, depending on, I don't know how the camera's picking it up. But I put a lot of time and effort into something like that because the point of it is to look nice, to be presented as a gift, and so that's what it's made for. Whereas this is one of the inserts I made from a toolbox. And, I took the time to cut dovetails for the corners because it's strong, but it also looks nice. But, to put this little handle in here, I just used a screw because it's to hold tools. And it doesn't need to be the greatest thing ever. It needs to serve the purpose that I intended it for. And it's made out of pine because it's cheap and sturdy. If I built a tool chest out of mahogany, it would weigh a lot more, and it would still get just as beat up, but I would probably feel worse about it, and it would also cost me a lot more money. So there's wisdom in knowing when and how to put your effort and your energy into these things. And I think that not only is this applicable to actually building things, but to spiritual things as well. When we understand the trade-offs, we get out of this paralysis of always wanting to do the ideal, because we're surrounded by so much images of like perfection. Everybody is better at everything than us. If it wasn't for the realization that lesser things can still provide value and a service, I wouldn't even be making this video, because a drop in the bucket of people are going to see this compared to somebody watching Mike Winger or even PVK or Jordan Peterson or whatever. But if I didn't do it, not only would some small amount of people that watch it and enjoy it get that experience, but I wouldn't get the experience of getting to make this video. And even though they're not as polished as I wish they could be, and a lot of times I don't have the time to do the editing and add the clips, and the clips get blocked. A lot of times I don't even get to be in this area that I built to shoot videos in, then it's still contributing something. If I keep doing this year after year, this particular video may be forgotten, but at that time I will have gained the skills and the knowledge to do something that's really useful to somebody. We can't let the inability to make perfection keep us from doing what we can, because it's not really even about what we do. It's about the things that God gives us. God gives us opportunities. He gives us resources. He gives us talent. And we're doing what we can with it, and then we're giving it back to Him. And He's the one that accomplishes what He wants with it. If we're saying, oh, I never learned how to build because I knew I couldn't make a cathedral, but God says, well, I gave you a couple of boards and a handful of nails, and there was somebody that needed a bench to sit on, and why didn't you do it? Because in God's economy and in His way of doing things, He sees the value and the purpose of all these different things, from the lowest to the highest. Even if we don't perceive and understand, we might not even be able to make anything that's a complete thing. But the effort that we put forth in the areas where God has given us opportunity to serve, and this means all the aspects of our life, our family, our work, our relationships with our friends, our neighborhood and our household, and all these things, cleaning up the space you live in, and beautifying the garden, and all these little things that we think are by themselves not important. They're all opportunities to partner with God and work alongside Him and contribute something to the plan. There may be those people that work on those cathedrals that work their whole life and they never get to see the thing finished. They didn't even get to see part of it finished. They may work on one wall or one section and it's not even done in their lifetime. But when this thing is complete, if you were to take away the stones that they put in that spot, the whole thing would collapse. Likewise, when people build an arch, if you see a beautiful stone archway, until the last stone is put into place, that archway needs to be supported. And that means that there's somebody whose job it is to build a structure out of wood, a support for that arch, that once the arch is completed, that support is going to be taken down and thrown away. But without it, it wouldn't stand. And so even in the sense of the temporary things that we build and the temporary things that we do, what we perceive as temporary, it still contributes to the eternal plan that God is working on. So we don't need to be sad if we are only building tents and not temples, because God still cares about keeping people out of the rain. So everything we do contributes. And that's the mindset that we have to have. And that's what, if we can look at things that way, it will give us the wisdom not only to put in that effort to make things good and beautiful, but to see the beautiful and good value in the things that we otherwise would perceive as being lowly and unimportant. Because there's nothing unimportant in the world that God creates. Unless if we're just taking up space and we're just doing destructive things, if we're trying to contribute with what we have, we are, in a sense, making a difference. We are creating something beautiful, even if we don't get to see the finished product or the final result. So hopefully that would encourage someone, and I hope that maybe it'll inspire you to do something useful and be creative and build something, or even apply it to some other area of your life that has nothing to do with any of what I talked about. If you get the gist of what I'm saying, hopefully it'll be of use. So, thank you.